The fourth dance was ending, and still the Duke of Renfield had not let go of Celia Fairbank's hand. The ballroom at Renfield Hall held 300 guests that night, and every one of them was counting. A first dance might be courtesy, a second might be carelessness, but a fourth, in a man's own house, with his wife standing 20 feet away beneath the portrait of his grandmother, was a declaration, and the room knew it the way a room always knows, with a hum that never quite becomes a word. Eleanor, Duchess of Renfield, stood by the marble column with a glass of lemonade she had not touched, and she was smiling. That was the detail the gossips would argue over for years, the thing that made no sense to them. Her husband had opened her own ball with her own best friend, had given away the first dance that belonged to the Duchess by every law of custom and decency, and the Duchess was smiling, calm as a woman watching weather arrive that she herself had ordered. Near the great doors a footman was bending toward the master of ceremonies, and the master of ceremonies had gone pale. And in the card-room beyond, though no one yet knew it, 2 magistrates were quietly asking for a man named Harlow. And if you had leaned close to Eleanor in that moment, close enough to see past the diamonds to the steadiness beneath, you might have heard her murmur to no one at all, "Wait for the last waltz." If you have ever watched someone you loved and someone you trusted smile at each other across a room and understood, in one cold drop of a moment, that the smile was at your expense, then you already know Eleanor better than her husband ever did, and this story is for you. So while the orchestra tunes for the 5th dance, do one small thing for me. Press subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you are listening from. Because stories like this, one travel farther than the people who caused them ever will. Tonight you will watch a duke hand away everything that mattered one dance at a time. And you will watch the woman he called dull take it all back in a single evening. Without raising her voice, without shedding a tear, without breaking the rhythm of the music. By the last waltz, a prince will cross that floor, and the Duke of Renfield will finally understand what he had, precisely at the moment it stops being his. But to understand that night, you have to leave the ballroom. You have to go back 6 years, to a grey morning in a lawyer's office that smelled of ink and old leather, where a marriage was arranged the way men arrange the sail of a bridge. Eleanor Whitlock was 22 years old, the only child of Josiah Whitlock, who had begun life hauling pig iron on the canals of the north and ended it owning a respectable share of the canals themselves. Josiah had money the way old families had portraits, in quantities that embarrassed the people who needed it most, and no one needed it more than Edmund, 7th Duke of Renfield, who had inherited 30,000 acres, a house with a leaking roof over the long gallery, his father's debts, his grandfather's debts, and a talent for noticing none of it. The bargain was never spoken aloud, because bargains of that kind never are. Josiah's daughter would become a duchess. Edmund's roof would stop leaking. The lawyers called it a settlement. Eleanor, who had been raised on her father's knee amid bills of lading and interest tables, who could find the error in a column of figures the way other women found a dropped stitch, understood exactly what she was and exactly what she was for. She signed her name in a clear, steady hand, and she told herself, because she was 22. That fondness might grow in time the way ivy grows on even the coldest wall. Renfield Hall did not want her. The house was beautiful the way a frozen lake is beautiful, and about as warm. Edmund was courteous at breakfast and absent by supper, a man of excellent manners and no attention, who spoke to his wife in the pleasant, empty tone he used with people he would never need to know. When she asked in the first month about the estate accounts, he laughed, not unkindly, and said the steward managed all that dreary business. And when she offered, in the second month, an observation about the timber contracts, something shifted behind his eyes, a shutter closing. And she learned the lesson every unwanted wife learns eventually. She learned not to offer her opinion. So she offered it to the ledgers instead. Quietly, over years, without title or thanks, Eleanor became the mind of Renfield. She found the granary rents that had gone uncollected for a decade. She found the coal merchant charging twice for one delivery. She sat up with the books while her husband sat up with his port, and the estate steadied under her hands like a ship that finally has someone at the wheel, and Edmund never asked why the figures improved. Because it never occurred to him that figures could belong to a woman. He believed the estate had simply remembered its duty. Men like Edmund believe the world tidies itself, and into that cold, well-managed loneliness, in the third year came warmth, or what wore warmth's face. Celia Fairbank had been Eleanor's dearest friend since they were girls at Miss Harrow's school in Bath, the two of them inseparable, the merchant's daughter and the poor cousin of a good family, both outsiders among the porcelain daughters of the gentry, both clever enough to know it. Celia was everything Eleanor was not. Where Eleanor was still, Celia glittered. Where Eleanor thought before she spoke, Celia spoke and made thinking look tedious. She could enter a room the way a candle enters a dark hallway and make every face turn toward her, and Eleanor, who had spent 3 years as the invisible mistress of a visible house, loved her for it. When Celia wrote that her situation had grown difficult, that her uncle's patience and her small annuity were both exhausted, Eleanor did not hesitate for an hour. "Come to Renfield," she wrote. "Come and stay as long as you like. Stay forever, if it suits you." And Celia came, with 2 trunks and 1 bandbox and that laugh that could pull sunlight through a shut window. And for a season Renfield Hall was almost a home. Eleanor gave her the blue room with the eastern light. Eleanor gave her gowns from her own dressmaker, a horse from the stables, pin money that Celia called a loan, and they both understood was a gift. Eleanor gave her a London season and stood at the edge of ballrooms, watching her friend be admired, feeling the plain. Sturdy happiness of a person who has finally found someone to spend her kindness on. Remember that, because Celia will not. Every silk Celia wore that year, Eleanor chose. Every door that opened to her opened because a duchess held it. The perfume she wore, orange blossom and something darker beneath, Eleanor had bought for her in Bath in a little shop off Milsom Street, 2 bottles. 1 for each of them, a joke between friends, so that they might be mistaken for one another in the dark. Keep that bottle in your mind. It matters later. Because it was somewhere in that golden season, between the gowns and the loans and the laughter, that Celia Fairbank looked around Renfield Hall, at the silver, at the park, at the handsome, inattentive man at the head of the table, and performed the one calculation Eleanor never thought to check. Celia looked at her friend's life and decided it was wasted on her friend. It did not begin with anything so honest as a seduction. It began with attention, which was the one currency Edmund had never spent on his wife and therefore had entire. Celia listened to him. She asked him about his horses and remembered the answers. She lost to him at cards by exactly enough. At dinner she placed herself where the candlelight favoured her and laughed at the observations his own wife had stopped laughing at years ago, and Edmund, vain in the deep, unexamined way of men who have never once been refused, began to turn toward her the way a weather vane turns, without decision, without resistance, simply because the wind was blowing from that quarter now. Eleanor saw none of it at first. That is the truth, and it is an embarrassing truth, and the narrator owes it to you straight. She saw her husband becoming pleasanter at dinner and thought the house was thawing at last. She saw her friend drawing Edmund out and was grateful, actually grateful, that someone could. The wife who keeps the books sees every falsehood in a column of figures and none across her own table, because the heart audits nothing where it has already extended credit. The first entry in the other ledger, the one Eleanor did not keep, was small, a cent. Edmund came in late from what he called a ride to the far plantations, and as he passed her in the corridor, candle in hand, she caught it on his coat, orange blossom and something darker beneath. Her own perfume, she thought for one strange second, except that she had not worn hers in a year. The second entry was a bill. Her dressmaker in town, a good discreet woman, sent the quarter's account, and in it, itemized between Eleanor's own grey silk and the mending of a riding habit, stood a gown of rose-coloured sarcenet that Eleanor had never ordered, in measurements that were not hers, charged to the estate. The third entry walked into the drawing-room on a Tuesday in her grandmother's pearl combs. Eleanor's grandmother had been a canal-keeper's wife who saved 40 years for those combs, and Eleanor kept them in the japanned box on her own dressing-table, and there they were, gleaming in Celia's dark hair above the rose-coloured sarcenet, and Celia touched them lightly and said, Edmund insisted, "He said they suited me better than the box they were sleeping in. You don't mind, dearest, do you?" And the room went very quiet, and Eleanor heard her own voice from somewhere just behind her own shoulder say, "Of course not. Of course not." She did not weep. She did not rage. She did not lie awake composing speeches. What she did that night, alone in the study with one candle, was something colder and older and entirely her own. She took down a fresh ledger, a plain marbled book from the stationer's parcel, and she opened it to the first page, and at the top, in the clear, steady hand that had signed away her life 6 years before, she wrote a date. Nothing else, just the date. Because Josiah Whitlock's daughter knew one thing above all the things she knew, and it was this: you do not argue with people who are robbing you. You do not accuse, you do not plead, you do not warn. Accusation without proof hands a guilty man the high ground and a guilty woman the exits. No, you count. You enter each item as it occurs, in date order, in ink, and you wait, with the patience of compounding interest, because patience properly aimed is not weakness. Patience properly aimed is revenge waiting for its moment. And the moment, though none of them yet knew it, already had a date of its own, printed on no calendar but coming all the same, the night of the Michaelmas ball, the night of one stolen first dance and one last waltz. The winter that followed was the coldest anyone at Renfield could remember, and the cold was not in the weather. Celia did not leave. The visit that had no ending now revealed itself as an occupation, and she moved through the house with a new proprietary ease, rearranging rooms, countermanding menus, dispensing little instructions to the servants in a voice that had borrowed a duchess's cadence the way she had borrowed a duchess's combs. The servants obeyed her with their hands and watched Eleanor with their eyes, and Eleanor gave them nothing to watch, which the wise ones understood and the foolish ones mistook, and still she counted. The rose sarcenet was joined in the ledger by a pelisse, a fur tippet, a pair of diamond eardrops billed as estate expenses under the magnificent heading of sundries. A bracelet Edmund had given his wife on their first anniversary, thin gold, almost apologetic, vanished from the japanned box and reappeared on a slimmer wrist at dinner, and Eleanor entered it. Item, 1 bracelet, gold, observed on Miss Fairbank, the 14th of January. The ink dried the same on every line. That is the mercy of a ledger. It does not gasp. But it was the estate accounts, the real books, where Eleanor found the wound beneath the insult. She had kept Renfield's figures long enough to know their tides, and the tides were wrong. Rents from the eastern farms arrived late, then arrived lighter, then arrived in Mr. Harlowe's fresh, clean copies with no counterfoils behind them. Mr. Harlowe, the steward, a neat grey man with an apologetic cough who had served Edmund's father, began bringing her summaries instead of books. And when she asked for the books themselves, he coughed and regretted that they were with the binder, and a month later regretted that they were with the auditor, and no binder and no auditor were ever named. 3 tenant families were served notice for arrears Eleanor knew they had paid. Because she had recorded the payments herself before the recording was taken from her, Harlowe having persuaded Edmund over port that her grace ought not to be burdened with men's sums. Edmund had agreed the way he agreed to everything that asked nothing of him. And the money moved, small sums at first, then confident ones, out through a channel called improvements to a contractor no county directory had ever heard of, and Eleanor sat with the candle low and followed the figures the way a physician follows a pulse, and the figures told her what figures always tell the patient listener. This was no longer a husband's infatuation being petted and dressed at his wife's expense. This was a system. Someone was bleeding Renfield with a ledger in one hand, and someone else was holding the Duke's attention like a bright cloth before a bull, and on the night she finally understood that those two someones were working the same beast together, she closed the marbled book, sat back, and felt the strange clarifying calm of a woman who has stopped hoping she is wrong. It was a Thursday in March when she heard it said aloud. She had come down after midnight for the household inventory left in the small library. No candle, slippered feet on stone, she had walked 6 years in the dark. And the door of Edmund's study stood half open, lamplight lying across the corridor floor like a dropped glove, and she heard her own name. Not Eleanor. Her, the Duchess. Celia's voice, low and amused, wrapped around the stem of a wine-glass. And Edmund's answer, the pleasant, empty tone she knew from breakfast, saying the sentence that she would carry to the ballroom, to the lawyers, to the end of the story. She keeps the books, and she keeps her silence loyal, dull, and she suspects nothing, my dear. Women like my wife are furniture. You may sit on them for years, and they never once complain. And Celia laughed, that candle in a dark hall laugh that Eleanor had loved since Bath, and said, Then you shall have comfort, and I shall have you. For I find I want you for having, not keeping. Keeping is her gift. Let her keep the house while you and I spend it. Glass touched glass, small and silvery, a toast in her own house to the spending of her own life. Eleanor stood in the dark corridor and did not move. She did not gasp. She did not press her hand to her mouth the way betrayed wives do in paintings. She stood very still, listening, while the two people she had fed and clothed and trusted laughed together in the lamplight, and something in her chest did not break, as she had always assumed it would, but rather settled the way a house settles onto its true foundation, one deep quiet crack and then stillness forever. She counted 30 of her own heartbeats. Then she walked back the way she had come, on slippered feet up the cold stairs, past the blue room with its eastern light, and sat down at her dressing table, and looked at the japanned box that no longer held her grandmother's combs, and made the decision that separates this story from a sad one. She would not confront. She would not weep at him, plead with her, stage the scene they were both so carelessly certain she would never stage. A scene would cost them one uncomfortable evening. She intended to charge more. She would act once, completely, and never need to act again. And to do that she needed what every judge and every gossip and every banker in England respected more than tears. Paper from that night, Eleanor of Renfield became two women. One of them poured tea, praised Celia's playing, wished her husband good morning, dull, loyal, suspecting nothing, furniture that smiled. The other, in the hours when the house slept, built the file. She copied Harlow's summaries before they went into the fire, dated her copies, noted the discrepancies in a margin as clean as a hymnal. She listed every gift, every gown, every stone of her mothers and grandmothers that had migrated to the blue room, with values, with dates, with witnesses where witnesses existed, and she began delicately to pull at the thread called improvements, writing in her own name, as if on household matters, to tradesmen and county clerks, the Duchess's small polite questions that no one thought to fear, and the answers accumulated like snow on a roof, weightless flake by weightless flake, until the day the roof would come down all at once. She was not alone. That was her second discovery, and it surprised her more than the first. The overlooked see the overlooked, and Renfield Hall, it turned out, had been watching on her behalf for years. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, 60 and square and unsentimental as a strong-box, came to her one evening with her ring of keys and a look that dispensed with preamble, and said only, "There are letters, Your Grace. Miss Fairbank writes many letters and does not always burn what she thinks she burns, and I have a locked drawer, and I have kept what the greats kept, it being my duty to see the greats swept." In the drawer, smooth flat, singed at one corner, lay half a correspondence in Celia's pretty looping hand, and the half was enough. Letters to Mr. Harlow, my dear H., letters that spoke of the Improvements Fund with a shareholder's warmth, letters that priced Edmund's affections against the settlement she expected and found the arithmetic pleasing. Letters in which the word Eleanor appeared exactly twice, both times beside the word manage, as in she is easily managed, as in leave the managing of her to me. Then there was Mr. Tobin. Tobin was a junior clerk at the county bank, a serious young man with ink-stained cuffs, whose sister Eleanor had stood godmother to in the estate church, unasked, because the family were her tenants and it was right, and Tobin asked to see her on a market day, hat in both hands, and said, "Your Grace, I may lose my place for this, but the bank has instructions I cannot square with honesty. Drafts on the estate account, countersigned with the Duke's signature, except," and here he laid two papers side by side, "that a man's hand does not change with the seasons, and this one does." The signature on the December draft and the signature on the March draft had been made by two different pens pretending to be one man, and Josiah Whitlock's daughter, who had watched her father detect a forged bill of lading across a candle-lit desk when she was 9 years old, looked at the loops and the pressure and the too careful E, and knew that the improvements fund was no longer merely theft. It was forgery, and forgery was not a scandal. Forgery was a rope. And last, unlooked for, came the dowager. Edmund's mother had frightened Eleanor for 6 years. An old eagle in black silk who visited twice a year, found fault with the flowers and left, and when her carriage arrived unannounced that April, Eleanor prepared for inspection. Instead, the old woman waved the servants out, sat straight as a mast, and studied her daughter-in-law for a long moment with eyes that missed nothing, and then said, "I have buried a husband and 2 brothers, and I have watched this family survive a gambler, a drunkard, and a fool, and it has survived because its women declined to sink with its men. My son is entertaining his mistress under your roof, and his steward is picking his pocket while he applauds. Do not look startled, child. I am old, not blind. I cannot make him decent. But the name on that gate was my burden before it was yours, and if you mean to save the estate rather than merely escape it, then whatever you are building in that study after midnight, and I know you are building something, you have my hand, my witness, and my lawyers, who are older and crueler than his." And so the file grew, page by page, ally by ally, the housekeeper's drawer, the clerk's duplicates, the dowager's cold blessing, the tenant's receipts gathered at church doors in a folded shawl, and through all of it Eleanor poured tea and smiled, and Celia, glittering, triumphant, certain, danced her occupation through the public rooms of Renfield, and never once looked down at the floor to wonder what was moving beneath it. It was in the middle of that patient year, and this is the part of the story nobody in the county saw coming, least of all Eleanor, that the surveyor arrived. The west levels of the estate had flooded 3 winters running, drowning good pasture and better rents, and among the polite inquiries Eleanor had scattered through the county was one to an agricultural society regarding a man who understood drainage, and the society sent her Mr. Nicholas Gray. He came on a hired horse with 1 valise and a leather roll of instruments, a tall, quiet man of perhaps 35 in a plain brown coat that had been brushed more often than replaced, and he stood in the wet field with her land in his eyes and none of her rank in them. And that was the first strange thing. Because Eleanor had spent 7 years being looked at as a duchess or overlooked as a wife, and this man simply looked at the problem beside her as though she were the other engineer. He asked what the fields had done each winter, and when she answered from memory levels and dates, and the cost of every failed culvert, he did not marvel that a duchess kept such things in her head. He took out his notebook and said, "Good. Then we shall not waste a fortnight discovering what your grace already knows," and wrote her answers down as evidence, which no man had ever once done in her hearing. They worked. Through that spring and into the summer, over theodolites and county rolls and mud that ruined 2 pairs of her boots, the Duchess of Renfield and the surveyor in the brown coat drained the west levels. And if you had asked her what was growing there, she would have said barley. He was exact without vanity, and listened without waiting to speak, and he had a dry, buried humour that surfaced perhaps once an afternoon and sank again before you could be sure of it. He never flattered her. He disagreed with her twice, plainly, and was right once and wrong once, and admitted the second with more grace than Edmund had ever admitted anything. She found herself, On the mornings he was expected, working faster through Harlow's crooked figures, so that the afternoon would be free, and she told herself it was the barley. There was one afternoon, with the first water moving clean through the new cut and the smell of turned earth all around them, when he watched her total a column of costs in her head faster than he could on paper, and he said, quietly, not as gallantry but as a measurement, whoever taught this county that you were ornamental ought to be dismissed for incompetence. And Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in a year, and then stopped, astonished at the sound. Remember him, standing in the mud with his notebook telling the truth. He is why the last waltz matters. Because everything else that summer was tightening. Harlow had begun to feel the polite questions at his back, the way guilty men always eventually feel them. Some tradesman mentioning her Grace's letter, some clerk growing shy, and a cornered steward does not retreat. He escalates. And Harlow escalated with the boldness of a man who had measured the Duke's inattention for 30 years and knew its exact depth. One morning in September there was a document on Eleanor's desk, laid square in the centre of the blotter like the final move of a long game. It was a deed of assignment, drawn fair in a law hand, by which the Duchess's marriage settlement, her own £30,000, the canal money her father had walled around her like a keep, would be pledged against the estate's improvements, and it wanted only her signature, and beneath it lay a note in Edmund's hand, or in what the world would swear was Edmund's hand, my dear Eleanor. Sign where shown, the lawyers assure me it is mere formality. She read it twice, and understood the architecture whole. Her money was the last strong room in Renfield, and they had come for it, and if she signed, Celia and Harlow would bleed the settlement as they had bled the rents, and if she refused, she would be the obstinate wife obstructing her husband's improvements. And the whispers Celia had been seeding all season in drawing-rooms from here to London, poor Renfield, his Duchess grows so difficult, so odd, so unsteady, would ripen into something with lawyers of its own. Sign and be robbed, refuse and be ruined. It was, she admitted, examining it as her father would have, beautifully made. She did neither. She wrote instead to the dowager's lawyers in London, older and crueler than his, and enclosed her copies. The drafts with their 2 pretending pens, the letters from the locked drawer, the receipts in the folded shawl, the deed of assignment with its note, and the reply that came back by private messenger was 1 line long. And she burned it after reading, and the line was, "Mad, you have enough. Name the night." And here the story pauses. Because Eleanor did something in that last week of September that tells you who she is better than any speech, and you should see it plainly. She could have ended it quietly. Lawyers in a panelled room, a separation drawn in decent privacy, the county never certain of anything but rumour. That was the safe road, and the dowager herself argued for it. But Eleanor had been humiliated in particulars, at her own table, in her own corridors, before her own servants, item by item, and she had entered every item. And a ledger, as she told the old woman across the tea-things, must balance in kind as well as in sum. "They laughed at me privately," she said, "so they will answer publicly. Not because I love spectacle, but because the debt is public, whether they know it yet or not. And there is one night already fixed on every calendar in this county, when all of them, my husband, my friend, his steward, and the 300 people they have been performing for, will stand in one room of my house at 1 hour. and it would be wasteful your grace to build the scaffold twice. The Michaelmas ball at Renfield Hall. The invitations had gone out in August under the Duchess's name, as they had gone out every year of her marriage. Celia had spent a month planning her gown, and 2 days before the ball, at the edge of the drained west field with the barley stubble pale around them, Nicholas Gray told the Duchess he was leaving England. He said it looking at the water, not at her. The work here is finished, and I am called home. There are affairs, family affairs, that I have left too long, and I find, and here the buried humour surfaced and did not sink, but held, wavering, I find I have stayed 1 season past my business already, and a man in my position ought not to say why. She did not ask his position. She thanked him for the levels in a voice that stayed perfectly even, which by now you will understand was not the same as feeling even. And he bowed over her hand exactly as correctly as a plain surveyor bows to a duchess 1 breath too long, and rode away on the hired horse, and Eleanor stood in the stubble, telling herself the ache under her ribs was only the ordinary grief of finishing good work, and that night she did not open the marbled ledger at all, and that is the only night in the whole year it stayed shut, and you may enter that item in your own books and draw what conclusions you please. She did not know. Of all the people in this story who failed to see what stood before them, Edmund blind to his wife, Celia blind to the floor beneath her, Harlow blind to the reckoning walking toward him in polite question after polite question, the Duchess herself was blind in exactly 1 place, and it wore a brushed brown coat. She did not know that the Agricultural Society had sent her no ordinary surveyor. She did not know that the quiet man in the mud had a name that appeared in the almanac with a small crown beside it. Nicholas, Prince of Oldenburg, 2nd son of a sovereign house, who had spent 2 years travelling as plain Mr. Gray to learn land and water the way his grandfather insisted every Oldenburg learn something real with his hands. And she did not know, because he had been careful she should not, that a letter had gone from him to the Lord Lieutenant of the county the morning after he was called home, asking, with a foreigner's precision, whether an invitation to the Michaelmas ball at Renfield might still find him, as there was, he wrote. 1 piece of unfinished business in that country, which he had discovered too late, was the most important business he had. Michaelmas came in on a hard, bright frost, and Renfield Hall lit every window for the first time in 7 years. 300 guests, the county entire, wax candles by the gross, the orchestra brought down from London at an expense Harlow had approved without blinking, because it was Celia who asked, and Celia herself, descending the great staircase at 9 o'clock in a gown of silver net over white satin that had cost, though the county did not know it, £40 of the Eastern rents, wearing pearl combs in her dark hair, her grandmother's combs. Eleanor, at the foot of the stair in deep blue silk, with no jewels at all but her wedding ring, watched her best friend come down her own staircase in her own grandmother's pearls, and inclined her head in welcome, and the servants ranged along the hall watched their Duchess do it, and Mrs. Price, standing among them with her keys at her waist, permitted herself the very smallest movement of the mouth, because Mrs. Price, alone of everyone in that blazing hall, knew what was in the locked drawer, and knew that a copy of everything in it had gone to London 3 days since. The first dance of a ball at Renfield belonged to the Duke and his Duchess. It had been so under Edmund's father and his father's father. It is the oldest and simplest grammar of a married house, and every guest in the room knew that grammar down to their bones. So when the orchestra struck up, and Edmund of Renfield crossed the floor past his wife, bowed, and led out Miss Celia Fairbank, the room did not gasp. 300 people at once made the sound of a room refusing to gasp, which is a far worse sound, a sort of collective indrawn hush, silk stopping, fans pausing, and then the over-loud resumption of talk that follows a public wound. He danced the first with Celia. He danced the second with Celia. At the third, an old baronet's wife near the fire said, quite audibly, "Well," and her husband said, "Hush, my dear," and did not mean it. By the fourth dance the ballroom had divided, as English rooms do, into those watching the Duke and those watching the Duchess, and the Duchess gave her watchers nothing. She moved along the edge of her own ball, seeing to the comfort of the dowagers, sending a footman for a wrap, praising a nervous girl's first gown, gracious, unhurried, smiling. And the longer she smiled, the angrier the room grew on her behalf, because there is nothing that turns a crowd like composure under insult. And Celia, spinning past in silver with a hand in Edmund's, mistook that anger for envy and glittered the brighter. She believed she was being crowned. She was being weighed. And somewhere between the fourth dance and supper, the doors of Renfield Hall admitted 3 latecomers, quietly. At the far end where the card-room gave onto the hall, 2 grave men in dark travelling clothes who spoke to nobody but the master of ceremonies, and behind them, waiting in the outer hall with his greatcoat still on, a third man whom nobody yet looked at twice. The 2 grave men were Sir William Peel, magistrate, and the senior partner of a London firm of lawyers, older and crueler than his, and they asked the master of ceremonies, in lowered voices, whether they might have a private word with Mr. Josiah Harlow, steward of this estate, no disturbance being wished on such a festive occasion, and the master of ceremonies, who had gone pale, led them toward the card-room where Harlow sat over whist, prosperous, cough all gone, drinking the Duke's port, with the Duke's money on the table before him. Eleanor did not watch them go in. She had positioned herself at that moment by the marble column under the portrait of Edmund's grandmother, in full view of the floor, lemonade in hand, precisely where a hostess should stand. And this is where you came in. This is the moment the story opened on, the fourth dance ending, the Duke still holding Celia's hand, the footman bending to whisper to the master of ceremonies, and the Duchess by her column, smiling, murmuring to no one at all, wait for the last waltz. What happened next happened the way ice breaks on a pond, one crack, then everywhere. From the card-room, not loud but carrying, came the sound of a chair going over backward, and Harlow's voice, stripped suddenly of 30 years of softness, saying, "Gentlemen, there is some mistake," and Sir William's voice, bland as Sunday, replying that there was indeed, and that it ran to some £11,000 and 2 counterfeit hands, and the whist tables emptied into the hall, and the hall pressed toward the card-room, and the music stumbled and stopped, and in the sudden vacuum of the ballroom 300 people heard the words "forgery" and "warrant," and taken in charge, travel from mouth to mouth like fire down a fuse. Edmund dropped Celia's hand. It is a small detail, and every account of that night agrees on it. At the word forgery, the Duke of Renfield dropped his partner's hand as if it had grown hot, and started toward the card-room, and found his way blocked courteously by the London lawyer, who held a folded paper and said, "Your Grace, before you speak with Sir William, You will wish to know that your signature is among the forged instruments, that the fraud upon this estate has been fully documented these 6 months, and that the documentation is not mine. It is your wife's. Every face in the hall turned. You have seen a field of wheat turn under one wind. That is how the faces turned, all together, away from the card room, away from the Duke. Toward the woman in deep blue by the marble column who set down her lemonade, at last untouched, and came forward into the cleared centre of her own floor, with the file under her arm, plain marbled boards, a stationer's ledger, carried the way other women carry a fan. She did not raise her voice. To the room at large she said only, my friends, forgive the interruption to your evening. Supper will be served notwithstanding. Then she turned to her husband, and the room achieved a silence no orchestra ever gets. Edmund, she said, and her voice was even. And it carried to the last row of dowagers. On the 14th of January, your steward and your guest charged a bracelet to the roof fund. On the 2nd of March, they paid her dressmaker out of the Eastern rents, while 3 of your tenant families were served notice for arrears they did not owe. On the 9th of March, a hand that was not yours signed your name to a draft for £800. And on the 11th of September, they laid a deed before me that would have signed my father's whole fortune into the same hole. Under a note in your hand, or in what I was meant to believe was your hand, and I confess, Edmund, that for one day I did believe it, and that day was the nearest they came to winning. She opened the ledger, and did not read from it. She knew it as she knew the West Levels, and she laid it open on the card table where all could see the clean columns marching down the page. It is all here, she said, dated, in order with the bank's duplicates and the receipts and the letters especially, and here she looked, for the first time that night, directly at Celia Fairbank, who stood alone now in the middle of the floor in her silver net. Because the crowd had performed that oldest of ballroom manoeuvres and simply receded from her on all sides, the way a tide goes out. I have read your letters, Celia, Eleanor said. Gently and gently was the cruellest register she could have chosen. You wrote that I was easily managed. You wrote that you wanted him for having, not keeping. I stood in the corridor in March, in the dark, outside that door, and I heard you both. I heard every word, and I went upstairs, and I began to keep the only thing in this house left worth keeping, the accounts. And Edmund, whose face had gone the colour of the tablecloth, said Eleanor, in the voice of a man waking in a strange house, and took one step toward her, and she stopped him with nothing at all. No raised hand, no cold word, only a level look that had 6 years and 1 corridor in it. You called me furniture, she said, without cruelty, laying the fact down like a stone on a grave. Loyal, dull, suspecting nothing. You were not here to be told otherwise, Edmund. You were never here. You gave my first dance away tonight in front of the entire county, and it was only the last item in a long account, and I find, on balancing it, and here, for one breath, something human moved under the marble and was mastered, I find the account closed. And it was at that moment, into that ringing silence, with Harlow being walked through the hall between 2 constables, and Celia standing marooned in silver, and the Duke of Renfield learning in public what he had spent 7 years not learning in private, that the master of ceremonies, who had been holding a card in his shaking hand for 10 full minutes, waiting for any gap in the catastrophe, did the only thing his office knew how to do. He struck the floor with his staff and announced the late arrival. His Royal Highness Nicholas, Prince of Oldenburg. And through the doors of Renfield Hall, greatcoat gone, in dark evening dress, with a single foreign order glinting at the breast, came a tall, quiet man of perhaps 35, whom the Duchess of Renfield had last seen in a brushed brown coat, standing in the mud of the West Levels, telling the truth. He crossed the emptied floor without hurry, past 300 motionless guests, past Celia Fairbank without the smallest flicker of notice, and past the Duke of Renfield as though the space he occupied were vacant, and he stopped before the Duchess, and he bowed, one breath too long, and the buried humour surfaced in his eyes and held there steady for everyone to see. "Your Grace," said the Prince of Oldenburg, "I am told the orchestra has one waltz left in it, and I have come a very long way to ask whether it is spoken for." And Eleanor, Duchess of Renfield, looked at the man who had written her answers down as evidence, in the ruin of her marriage, in the wreck of her ball, before the whole staring county, and did the one thing nobody in 7 years had seen her do freely. She gave him her hand. The last waltz at the Michaelmas ball was danced by candlelight at 1 in the morning. One couple alone on the floor for the first turn before the county remembered its legs, and the fiddlers, who were Londoners and knew a story when they were standing in one, played it slow. Her best friend had danced all night with the Duke. By the last waltz a prince had claimed the Duchess, and every person in that room understood they were watching the sentence of a court from which there is no appeal, the court of 300 witnesses, and that its verdict was already given. The reckonings came in their proper order that winter, each according to the rank of its guilt, and the county watched every one. Josiah Harlow stood his trial at the spring assizes, and the evidence walked into court in a plain marbled ledger and a banker's box of duplicates, and the Duchess was not even required to appear. Her documents being, as the prosecuting counsel observed with professional admiration, the most complete account of a fraud he had encountered in 30 years at the bar, dated, in order, in ink. Tobin, the bank clerk, gave his testimony in a steady voice with his sister in the gallery, and far from losing his place, ended the year as chief clerk, the bank having discovered a sudden institutional passion for men who cannot square dishonesty. Harlow was convicted on the forgeries in 1 hour, and only the exertions of his counsel kept the sentence to transportation for life rather than the rope. And he was taken down coughing, and the last the county ever heard of him was a name on a convict manifest bound for Van Diemen's Land, entered in somebody else's ledger, in date order, which was, Eleanor remarked to the Dowager, the only fitting end for a man who kept 2 sets of books, to finish as a single line in one. Celia Fairbank did not stay for the trial. She was gone from Renfield by first light after the ball, and gone from the county within the week, and the doors of the county closed behind her one by one, softly, the way good society closes doors, no scenes, merely a universal previous engagement. The letters were never made public, Eleanor saw to that. Not from mercy exactly, but because, as she told the Dowager, one does not empty the strong-box to pay a debt already settled, and unpublished letters keep their value. But everyone knew there were letters which served better than publication. Celia went to Bath, where the story had arrived before her, and then to Harrogate, where it arrived a week after her. And she was handsome for a good many years yet at watering place assemblies, and she ended as a companion to a rich widow with bad nerves, reading sermons aloud in return for her keep, managed, at last, by somebody else. Which was not the punishment Eleanor designed for her. Eleanor designed nothing for her. It was simply the sum Celia's own arithmetic came to, for she had priced herself in other people's fortunes all her life, and a woman who wants people for having, not keeping, must not be surprised when nobody keeps her. And there is the epitaph, and she wrote it herself with a wineglass in her hand, in a lamplit study, laughing. And Edmund. The world expected the Duke of Renfield to bluster, to blame, to retreat to town and be seen at his clubs being wronged, and the world was surprised. And it is the one surprise in this story the narrator is glad to report. Something had broken in Edmund on that ballroom floor. At the word furniture said back to him in his own wife's level voice before 300 people. And what broke was the lifelong glass between himself and consequence, and he did not have it repaired. The marriage was dissolved by means the lawyers found, the settlement restored intact, her father's money walled around her once more, and Edmund contested nothing. He signed where shown, which the dowager called the first honest signature in that house in a decade. He sold his hunters. He dismissed no servants. He raised the wages Harlow had shaved. He sat down before the tenants of the eastern farms and returned every shilling of the false arrears with interest in person at their tables, which cost him more than the money did. And on the morning Eleanor left Renfield Hall for the last time, he stood bareheaded on the steps and asked leave to say one thing, and said it before the assembled household, plainly, like a man reading his own audit. I was told all my life that I had inherited an estate, he said, and I have learned that I inherited a stewardship and slept through it. My wife kept what I was charged to keep, my books, my tenants, my name, and I kept nothing. Not even faith, and everything that has come upon this house came through the door I left open. I ask her forgiveness. I do not ask her to return. I know the difference now, and the knowing is her last gift to me, for nothing else was going to teach me. She looked at him for a long moment from the carriage step, at the negligent, vain, sorry man to whom she had been handed like a receipt at 22, and she said, I forgive you, Edmund, and I hope the knowing keeps. And observe, listener, what she did not say, and I will think of you kindly. She did not say, perhaps in time, she gave him forgiveness whole, and return not at all. Because forgiveness is not the same as return. Write that where you keep your own accounts. Then the carriage rolled, and Renfield Hall went behind her, roofline, gates, park, 7 years, and witnesses say she did not look back, and the witnesses are correct. She was married in June, in the estate church at Aldenburg, and the wedding confounded every expectation the word prince had raised. No cathedral, no state, a plain stone church smelling of beeswax and cut hay, and the pews filled with the people Nicholas had insisted on and Eleanor had seconded, land agents and engineers and half the agricultural society, and Mrs. Price in the second row in a new bonnet, pensioned into comfort but present by invitation as family, and Tobin, the chief clerk beside his sister, and the dowager Duchess of Renfield, straight as a mast in black silk, in the place of the bride's mother, having announced to scandalized London that she had lost a daughter-in-law, and declined to lose the daughter. The sovereign of Oldenburg, Nicholas's brother, gave a wedding breakfast at which he rose, and said that his grandfather had sent the princes of their house out to learn something real with their hands, and that his brother had accordingly gone to England to study water, and had instead come home having discovered the one thing rarer than good land, which is a person who tends what they are given whether or not they are thanked, and that the House of Oldenburg considered itself, on the whole, to have married up. And Eleanor Whitlock, who had been sold once and chosen never, stood up in a plain grey silk beside a man in a brushed coat, and was chosen publicly, permanently, by someone who had known her competence before her rank and her heart before either. And if you want the whole moral of her second marriage in one line, it is this: the first man signed for her fortune. The second man wrote her answers down as evidence. Years passed, as years do, and the reports that came back across the water made a settled music. The Princess of Oldenburg drained the north marshes of her new country, and the barley came up pale gold for miles. She kept her own ledgers all her life, every account in her own clear, steady hand, and the household treasurers of Oldenburg learned what the tradesmen of Renfield had learned before them, that nothing slept in her columns, and that kindness and exactness could keep house together. She raised children, and she raised them on two lessons, delivered not as sermons, but as habits, that you must be able to keep your own accounts, for no one can rob a person who counts, and that you must never mistake being useful to someone for being loved by them, for she had made both mistakes once each, and had paid for the pair in full, and considered the receipt worth framing. Edmund she never saw again. Once a year, at Michaelmas, a letter came from Renfield, and once a year it went unanswered into the drawer of her writing desk, unburned. Because some accounts one keeps open a single line's width, not for the debtor's sake, but for the record, and those who knew her best said the letters grew shorter and steadier down the years, and the last ones were simply the estate's accounts, honestly kept, submitted annually, as if to an auditor, which perhaps they were. And in that same drawer, on top of the letters, lay a small rectangle of pasteboard, gilt-edged, a little foxed with age, a dance card from a Michaelmas ball, the kind a lady wore at her wrist with a small pencil attached, and on it, in the space beside the last waltz, one name, in a hand more used to survey notes than to ballrooms, and nothing else on the card at all. Every other line blank, a whole evening's music unclaimed and unmourned, and one line kept. Her granddaughter found it there, years and years on, and asked why she had saved a card with only one dance on it, and the old princess looked at it for a moment and said, "Because that is the whole of it, my dear. That is the entire estate. People will take your first dance without asking. They will take it in your own house, before your own friends, and smile at you while the music plays, and you cannot stop them, and it does not matter. Let them have the first dance. Keep your books, keep your patience, keep your own name in your own hand, and see who asks for the last." So if this story found you standing by your own marble column, watching people you trusted smile at your expense, hear the one thing Eleanor of Renfield would say to you across all these years, and she would say it evenly, without cruelty, laying it down like a stone. Your worth was never in being chosen. It never was. It is in what you keep and how you keep it, and in the patience to let a long account come due. The music is not over. Somewhere beyond the doors they have not watched, your last waltz is already crossing the floor. If Eleanor's story reached you tonight, share in the comments the city you are listening from and one account of your own you finally closed. Subscribe if you want more stories where composure finishes what cruelty started, and until the next ballroom, keep your books and save the last dance.